Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the show. This is going to be the first in macroeconomics. Now, whereas in microeconomics, the focus was on the industry and the firm, in macroeconomics, our economic focus is on how a country manages its economy. Bear in mind that when nations have to manage their own economies, the problems are slightly different. When we're dealing with microeconomics, our questions are, at the top, how can business maximise its profits? Whereas when we're looking at macroeconomics, our overall questions are threefold. The question is, apart from understanding how does the national economy work, which will be discussed in more detail in the next class and in the next video, our overriding questions are three. Number one, connected, 1, 2, 3, connected with 1, 2, 3, are the national economic problems. Before I tell you what they are, I've got to explain. For a government to remain in power, right, it has to be able to have the will of the people. And in order to have the will of the people and have the people behind them, one of their biggest concerns is as follows. Number one, that the money in their pocket it doesn't go down in value. In other words, prices don't go up. So therefore, the first thing that governments have to be able to do is, if the situation requires it, manage inflation. Right? They have to be able to manage inflation. If a government can manage inflation to the degree that on one side, values of things are going up so that people will invest in them, but on the other hand, people aren't going to feel, our money isn't worth anything anymore, right? Then they've managed inflation, then they will get a thumbs up from the public. The second problem is employment, or rather, avoiding the second macroeconomic issue is that when the government takes care of the economy and the finance ministry, people want to feel that that their jobs are stable and that they don't have to face unemployment. Now, this sounds fairly obvious, but the question is, why is that anything to do with the government? Can the government do anything about it? As we shall see in macroeconomics, there's quite a great deal that the government can do about it. But it also depends what type of unemployment it is and what the causes are. So the second thing is managing unemployment. People want to feel they've got jobs. They also want to feel that the money in their pocket actually has value. And number three is they want to have an equitable, that does not mean equal, an equitable distribution of wealth. Let's see what that means. That does not mean that everybody has the same amount. Because then people wouldn't bother working. They would say, listen, if I can have the same amount of money whether I'm working or not, right? Why should I bother to work in the first place? The meaning of equitable means that it appears to be just and fair, which would mean that there are plenty of opportunities to make huge profits, but on the other hand, you don't get individuals falling below a standard of living where they can't take care of their basic needs. So you're talking about things like access to medical care, access to education, access to sanitary services, that people shouldn't be in a position that they're too poor, right, that they haven't got enough wealth to be able to take care of their basic needs. So those are the following three. Right, firstly, managing inflation. second, unemployment, and the third, equitable distribution of wealth. What has this got to do with the government? Surely we've learned so far in economics that all this is actually based on private enterprise. And that's a good question. And in answering this question, one has to know the following two things. That one of the functions, or understood functions of the government, is to manage the economy. They have various tools of the trade, such as taxing, such as giving subsidies, such as influencing the interest rates, various tools of the trade that can actually manipulate the economy, the national economy, in order that it can maximise welfare for the people involved. And that happens if the economy finds itself developing any various weaknesses. Just because an economy, a national economy, has got a great potential, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to realise this potential without the government actively and intelligently being able to intervene so that the country is able to use its resources to the utmost. So those are the three problems: managing inflation, dealing with unemployment, and an equitable distribution of wealth. This introduces what's called the macroeconomic problem. What we're going to have a look at now for the rest of this class is we're going to look at the macroeconomic players. Now let's take this off the door. I say the players that in the national economy there are various things going on. Right? Firstly, we're looking at inflation levels. Right? We don't talk about prices. You can't talk about the price of the nation. But you can talk about whether prices are going up or whether prices are going down, and how far prices are going up. Those are things you can talk about. That's one of the players. Another one of the players is the people involved, is how much is being produced. We look at that. There are various ways of actually measuring it. A third way is, do we have demand curves? Yes, we do. We have the national demand. We call that the aggregate demand. We will introduce this soon. Do we have national supplies? Well, there's a nationwide supply of goods and services, just like people want goods and services. Right? Just like there's an aggregate demand, similarly there's an aggregate supply. Those are the players, each of which we're going to be having a look at. The problem is that some of them are more complex than others. And an analogy I'd like you to imagine is that it's a bit like an orchestra. Right, you've got string instruments, you've got percussion instruments, you've got wind instruments, right, and you've got brass instruments, and they all come together as an orchestra. With that analogy, we can use the same for the various players that are actually involved in the national economy. Now, you're all coming in to, so what we're going to do is, how we're going to introduce the players, we're going to construct together a diagram which actually shows where all the players stand, rather like where all the orchestra is standing, right, on the stage when they're all ready to play. So we're going to build up a diagram, and as we do round, we're going to go round, we're going to introduce all the various instruments and tell us something about them. Then in our future classes, we're going to see what's going to happen when they all come together, right, in, number one, identifying problems, and number two, in providing the music, or call it what it is, which it will hopefully will be able to solve the problem. Because the government does have the power, if it knows what it's doing, to be able to give the right nudges, to be able to push the right things in the right directions. So without any further ado, we'll go along and we'll look at the next one. Let's introduce the instruments. I assume that in all of you watching this, you know what demand and supply is, and that you're fully familiar with price, quantity, demand and supply and equilibrium. We have the same in macroeconomics, except that the focus is not the industry, which it was in microeconomics, but the national economy, which is all the goods and services that are produced by the nation. Let's use that as the diagram. Now, this usually introduces price, but in the national economy, we do not have price, we have PL, which is price level, right? PL we also don't have quantity because when it comes to quantity, that's okay for an industry. How many hairbrushes are produced? How many hamburgers are produced? But when we look at the things all together, we don't talk about quantity, we talk about the national quantity. The national quantity is called the GDP, which stands for Gross Domestic Product. We will define these in a few moments, right? And in fact, in short, we usually say that it's Y, right? We use Y for short, right, which is GDP. So on this axis we've got PL, on this axis we've got Y equals GDP. Price level, right, instead of price, and gross domestic product instead of quantity. Now, how do we calculate the price level of a country? Well, the way we do it is as follows. We do one way a simple way of doing it is by using an index. Now, let's say PL, price level index. Let's say that we're talking about the end of 2020. And let's say that for the beginning of January 2021, right, the price level index was 100. What do we mean by that in English? Why do we pick we'll make it simple, and why do we call it 100? The way that we calculate goods and services is by the following. We take what's called a basket of goods. What do I mean by a basket of goods? Take your typical family. Mum, dad, 2 kids. Right? Your typical household. Right? And all their tastes and all their necessaries. Right? Take your typical household. Now, find out what their expenses are for the month. Now, that might involve, say, a mortgage repayment or a rent repayment. They'd have to pay for their utilities. They'd have to pay for food and drink. They'd be having to pay for a certain amount for the necessaries, clothing and so on, and all the other various things that they're going to be spending money on. Okay, perhaps leisure, they work out what is the average cost. Now let's say that the average cost is $2,000. Okay, let's say, just for argument's sake, it's $2,000. Then so we'll give that an index of 100. That's the January index. Let's come back a few months later, April 2021. Now let's say that it's gone up. And let's say it's gone up by 20%. It's gone up by 2%. So that instead of the prices being $2,000, right, they are $2,040. So we give that an index of 102 because it's gone up by 2%. Follow? So that means that the PL has gone up. Right? It's a higher PL. Now, this is usually worked over 2-3 months periods. Let's come to the position in July 2021. Now, let's say in July in 2021 it's 104.4. Right? It's gone up slightly more, slightly faster. If over 2 periods, right, it continues to rise at an accelerated rate, therefore we have the position that the economy is in inflation. Because prices are rising more quickly. So what we do is we indicate it here on the graph. PL1, black, is this black, PL1, and over here, PL2, and that shows that the economy is in a state of inflation. Now, what would happen if in July it wasn't 104.4, but it was only 103? Has there been inflation? Well, it appears there has. But has it been going as fast as expected? No. Oh, sorry, as fast as it was in the previous period, rather. No. So therefore, we don't say it's inflation. We say that the economy is going up, but at a slower rate. Right? It's not quite deflation, is it? Because then it would be going down. So what we say is that the national economy is in the state of disinflation. Now, sometimes it can happen, right? Sometimes it can happen that prices actually go down. Let's say that in July, let's say that over a 2-month period, right, the indexes were, instead of 100, 102, we say it would be 99, and then say 90, 98. Then what would be happening was that the economy would be in deflation. The important thing to note is as follows, that you can't always tell from a diagram like this whether the economy is actually in disinflation or whether it is in inflation. Okay, if prices are going down, then it will probably be deflating, although you could still argue that it might be in disinflation as well. Now, as you can see, the markings on this diagram sort of give you relative information rather than actual information. Are we now all happy on the first player, which is price index, or how much goods and services cost? And if they're going up at an accelerated pace, inflation. If they're going up at a decelerated pace, disinflation. And if they're going down, in costs are going down, then it is deflation. By the way, if it is going up at the speed that it's been going up in Zimbabwe, right, it is no longer inflation, it is called hyperinflation. Now, inflation isn't good news. Too much inflation isn't good news. A bit of inflation doesn't matter, you know why? Because if somebody's investing money in your country and is getting a high value for his money, for his or her money, that's good news. You want to keep investors happy. But don't make it go too far. You know why? Because again, all the consumers complaining, we're being paid the same wages, but the prices are going up. So that's our first player, the price level. You will now move on to our second player. Let's take this off first. Our second player is the gross domestic product. This is interesting because it sounds very nice when you first define it. GDP, gross domestic product, what is it? Well, that's not too difficult to work out. Do you know why? For the following reason. That it's the total of all the goods and services that the country produces over a 12-month period. So if we say that a country X has got a GDP of 100 billion, right? 100 billion. That's the total value of goods and services. Okay? Now, when we say GDP, that stands for gross domestic product. And this is important to define it. The gross domestic product means that you take the country, you look at all the goods and services that are produced inside the country, and you work out the value. But what happens if some foreign companies own goods and services? Like, for example, in this country, Intel has got a fair number of factories here in this country and premises. Does that go on Israel's GDP, or does it go on, the US GDP? The answer is that if you're using GDP as a statistic, anything that's owned within the borders of Israel belongs to Israel's GDP in this particular example. Now, what happens if, let's say, somebody living in this country owns a nice property in Switzerland? Owns a chalet in Switzerland, right? And he's getting income from it here. That chalet in Switzerland does not count to the GDP. It counts to the Swiss GDP, because that's where the operations is taking place. So the GDP is is all goods and services produced within the geographical area of the particular nation that we're actually looking at. So that's so far so good. Gross domestic product. Gross domestic product. However, the question, and how do we show it? We show it over here, simply with Y. Y1 might be the gross domestic product. Okay? Let's just put it there for the moment. If the country's improving its gross domestic product and it's producing a lot more, it might go up to Y2. Okay? The problem is that let's say that this country is producing $100 trillion a year. And that's the whole total value of goods and services. The question is, how do you calculate it? Right? That's a problem. Because how do you measure such a thing? You can measure a turnover of an industry, but you can't measure how much an industry produces or how much a business produces. That's okay, you can look at the business's accounts. But how can you look at the national accounts? Well, the way we do that is as follows. GDP, right, equals, that's the gross domestic product. There are three ways of calculating it. Each one has got its own problems. You can either use national income. Right? Or, now, the national income is how much money is coming in. You should know one rule that you know from macroeconomics, that one person's income is somebody else's expenditure. Now, if you add up all the national income, how would you do it? Well, let's go and see what makes up the national income, what everybody gets. Firstly, we get wages, don't we? Salary, we're paid for our work. But we don't get all our money from salaries. Some people don't get salaries. You know what they get instead? They get profits because they're in business. Some people have got money in shares. They get paid out dividends. Some people have got investments. They receive interest rates. So there are all sorts of things that you have to add up. Some people might be on the social security. You could argue they receive money, and that's called a transfer payment. So you have to add up all the incomes, and that would be the GDP. That's one method. Another method is as follows. We have national expenditure. What's national expenditure? What we're actually talking about is the people that demand goods and services. Right? Now, in economics, the word demand, as I've told you before, right, is misleading. You can't just say, I demand an ice cream, because if you haven't got the money to pay for it, right, your demand was of no interest to an economist whatsoever. Right? To a classical economist or to an Adam Smith type economist, because it assumes that you can pay for it. The only way that you demand in economics is with your money. Now, how does that affect the nation? Well, let's look at the people who actually spend money. Firstly, there's people like you and me, consumers. We buy goods, we buy services, we eat them, right? We buy food, we buy clothes, but they're for our own use. We buy a car, right? That's for our own use. We even buy a house, that's for our own use. So one lot of people are consumers. Other people buy stuff as well. You know who they are? They're investors. Now, the difference between investors is as follows. If you buy yourself a house to live in, then you're a consumer. But if you buy that house in order to rent out to somebody else and get money from it, then you are an investor. If you buy yourself a Swiss watch in order to wear, right, that's your own personal thing, then you're a consumer. But if you're buying a second Swiss watch, not to wear, but the idea that it's going to double its value in a couple of years' time, then you are an investor. Investors also spend money, do you understand? There's consumers and investors. What about the government? Government buys goods and services from all sorts of places. If you're working for a government office, you're being paid. You're working for the government. What happens about government schools? Most schools in most countries are run by the government. What about hospitals? What about cleaning the roads? All these sorts of things are government services. So if you, and the other people that also spend money on the stuff that the country produces, foreigners, they also spend money. So do you understand that if you add up all the money that's coming into the country from that's being spent, from consumers, from investors, from the government, and also from foreigners, and don't forget to deduct the money that leaves the country, because your country might buy goods and services from other countries, but from foreigners, that should equal the national expenditure. So therefore, your national income right, which is things like wages, profits, and all the other bits and pieces, should equal the national expenditure, which is what consumers pay, what investors pay, and so on. That's the second way. Now we come to the third way. Right, the third way of being able to measure the GDP is the national output. Which means the total value of all goods and services produced by the country. Add them up, and that'll give you the national output, which should equal the national expenditure, which should equal the national income. Those should all balance. We've got a problem or two there. It's not as easy as it looks. Firstly, right, you've got a problem with double counting. What do you mean by double counting? That means that let's say that the country produces motor vehicles, and it also produces parts for motor vehicles. It produces engines. So what's going to be happening is that the engine of the car is going to go on the engine account. Then what happens, because the engines were produced separately. Then what happens is that the car company buys the engine, puts it in the car, and that the engine also is counted as part of the value of the car. So it's on the engine account and it's in the car account. So it is being double counted. The way you get around this problem is that you don't add up the value of all goods and services, but you only add up the value of goods and services at their final destination. So you would count the car engine at its final destination, right, is on the account of those that produce the car, of those that actually produce the car, rather than the engine factory. That is the easiest way to be able to avoid double accounting. Does this work? Well, it gives you an approximation. In theory, the GDP should be the national income, which should be exactly the same as the national expenditure, which should be the same as the national output. But of course, it doesn't always happen that way. Not always. For example, what about goods and services produced that the government doesn't know about? That could create an imbalance. What about black markets? What about people that do work that's highly valued, but they're underpaid? Right, so you've got output, right, but they're not being paid for it. So it won't appear in the expenditure account. What about a young lady who's got 2 children screaming their heads off, right? 2 little children living at the top of a 25-floor apartment and doing what she can to bring them up properly, right? And all those hours that she actually spends taking care of her children, that's jolly hard work. Bringing up children is part of the national output. But does she get paid for it? No. So that's just one example of where things are not necessarily represented. On the other hand, you get cases of people who are actually being paid for things which they don't deserve. Right? If you're working typically for a government office and you're on a particular grade, you will be paid the same amount whether you happen to be a lazy worker or whether you happen to be an extremely hard-working worker. Right? Worker A, right, produces 10 units a day. Worker B produces 25 units a day. But the way that things are actually worked out, right, they're getting the same amount of money being paid, right, they're getting the same income, irrespective of the amount of work that they're being doing. So these are the problems that actually exist when you have to be able to work out the GDP, that whatever method you use, whether it is the income, whether it is the expenditure, or whether there's an output, there is likely to be an error, which is why we complete the equation with plus or minus error. Okay? In theory, the national income should balance, should be the same as the national expenditure, and should be the same as the national output. In reality, it's extremely unlikely that there's not going to be an error involved in the accounts. So we have now covered the second factor, right? The second factor, so the second player. Our first player was the price level. Our second player was the gross domestic product. And by the way, when you actually come to comparing countries, right, we actually work out also, we don't just talk about GDP, we also, later on, will be talking about GDP per capita. So if, for example, you take the United States and you work out the GDP of the United States, and you divide it by the number of people who are working, it should be something in the order of about $60,000, more or less. In some countries, like Ethiopia, it might be more like about $700. However, GDP per capita doesn't tell you the whole story, because you have to adjust those figures to also work about the cost of living. It costs a lot more to live in New York City than theoretically to have the same standard of living in a small Ethiopian town. So GDP per capita does not, though it's a useful figure, and it's something we will return to when we look in more detail at global economics, when we compare national economies with each other. Right? Be aware that it is not it's not a statistic. It's a statistic that has its problems as well. So now we've done we've done the first two players. Right? We've done the y-axis, price levels, and the x-axis, clumsily labelled y, right, where we look at the GDP. Now let's fill the graph in. And we will continue this on the second part of the considering the players in, and we will fill this in now, but it will be completed in the second part when we look at the players in macroeconomics. This is the AD curve. Now we will complete it at this level. The AD is we don't call it the demand. We're going to see how it is actually shown. The way it is actually shown on a macroeconomic diagram is that when the price of living is high, you're going to get fewer goods and services demanded by most people. When the cost of living is low, you're going to get more goods and services demanded. Right? So you're likely to get something like this. PL, Y1, and PL, Y2. Right? Now, as the price of living goes down, right, then what's going to be happening is that the demand for goods and services is going to go up. Just like individuals, similarly with communities that actually form the nation. The question is, how do we find the AD? We now need to define it. What makes up the aggregate demand? And this is our third player, AD. Right, we'll go as follows. AD equals. The first, now this takes you straight to what we just did when we looked at the national expenditure. Because the aggregate demand is the sum total of the national expenditure. But just like we calculated the national expenditure with 4 characters, similarly we're going to look at the AD with exactly the same characters. And they are C plus I plus G plus X take away N, where C equals consumers. That's people like you and me. We buy our things, we use them, and we enjoy them. I equals investors. G equals government. And X take away M is exports, because whenever our country exports something, we get money in return. It's because foreigners want it. There's something inconvenient, because at the same time, we're spending money buying things from foreigners. So it's exports take away IM. And X take away imports. And this can occasionally be a plus or it can be a minus. Where a country is exporting more, it can be a plus. Where the country is importing more, then that figure will actually become a minus from the GDP. These 3 characters that we've had a look at, which is price level, which is GDP, the gross domestic product, and aggregate demand, right? These form the first 3 out of the 4 characters that are part of the macroeconomic orchestra. I have left over aggregate supply, which is something that we will continue in our next episode. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.